Hello, everybody. Welcome back to English Champion. On this episode, another teaching breakdown. I've had some good responses about this little series that I've been doing, and so I thought I would create another installment for you. I've done one post that was done in written form, so you can see comments for how I teach. I did another that was about introducing something that would be very complex for students and not something they're would naturally enjoy. And so I showed a portion of a lecture where I ease students into new material. I did one yesterday on incorporating other fields of study to create connections, because creating connections in students' brains is so vital for comprehension and sticking in memory. So I did, a 10-minute clip or whatever about that on yesterday's Substack. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about history. The reason why is because there was a post going around last week that was basically making the argument that we are not teaching enough history in our classrooms, especially early classrooms, but it happens all the way up. And we spend so much time teaching English skills that maybe aren't as productive. And so the discussion was about, well, maybe we should be replacing some of that with actual explicit historical content, like teach history or geography or other social studies directly, not just through reading, but let's talk about these things as their own content area. And I could not agree more. Even as an English teacher, we ignore some of those other fields, again, especially at the lower levels, and that's not good. However, part of the argument that was being made was that, well, maybe the history instruction could just kind of replace some of that English instruction, that, we could be teaching history and then teaching the reading parts and some of the English ability through history. And that would be better because now they're learning more facts about history. And I was like, well, wait a second. What needs to be done instead is we need to have better English instruction that actually incorporates real history instruction as well. And so I'm asking teachers to be more interdisciplinary, to be a little more knowledgeable and scholarly, that we go beyond just, I only teach English, I only teach this literature. Well, any good English teacher should be teaching all sorts of topics, which is what I demonstrated yesterday, where I brought in psychology and we bring in philosophy and all these things into a literature lesson. And that's what I'm going to do here in this explanation from a historical standpoint. So I'm going to touch on a variety of topics still, but history shows up most in this segment that I'm going to share with you. And this isn't something that I just have done once in a while, that, I'm only cherry picking the times where I talk about history. All of my materials that I post, that teachers can go use, that parents can use with their kids, most of my stuff that's literature based anyway, incorporates a giant chunk of history within the instruction. When I would teach my live classes, half the class would be a history lesson, even though I'm talking about literature. And so just as examples, my course that I built for on economics and literature, well, a lot of that stuff is historically based because the study of economics has been around, for a couple hundred years now. So, I make lots of historical references in that class. My class on Flannery O'Connor, she wrote in a very specific time period. And so I reference kind of the Jim Crow South and what went on, post-Civil War and the politics of all that. And so that's part history in that course that I built. My course on the American Mind is about incorporating history into all of the other subject areas. And so we talk about that a lot. What are my other courses here? Even my sports class, we reference sports figures from the past, but we also reference literary and historical figures from the past. And so it's always history in the middle of an English topic. My study on the great novel, Black No More, which is about the Harlem Renaissance. And so I have tons and tons of resources that have links and photographs and, discussions of the political figures at the time and who the characters represent from real life at the time. So that class is as much history as literature. And even my class on existential philosophy and the book The Things They Carried is a historical reference because it's about Vietnam. And so I don't go into a ton of it because the book itself goes into Vietnam. But my kind of explanation and how I ease students into that is, well, I got to lay a little bit of groundwork here about what Vietnam was, where it took place, who was involved, why it's caused such historical kind of confusion and conflict as time has progressed, how we look back on it. There's a lot of mixed feelings about that era of our American history. So that's another class where we talk about history. So I do it all the time. Even in this section I'm going to show you here today, I actually I actually used even more history than I show you that are in other parts of the lecture. I just I had it more spread out, but this is just a continuous chunk I wanted to show you where I talk about Dickens himself as a historical figure. I show maps of what France would have looked like during the time period that we study this novel, and so like there's historical reference, and I create links that students can go to and see what it was like. Like there's history all through this, and so this isn't just a one-off. This isn't something that I only do occasionally. This is how I teach literature. This is how any teacher, English or literature professor, should be teaching that subject area. It should be in incorporation with history or science or philosophy or psychology or politics or whatever, because like I mentioned in the last video, we should be trying to get students to pull in as much information as they possibly can. So if they're confused by one thing, well, maybe they'll understand this other thing, and then we can connect them. If they're confused by that, well, here's another one. Let's try this. Now, does this make more sense? Constant connections. And again, this episode just happens to be heavy with history. So before I get into the history part, I am going to show you how I introduce this, because this is the first day of a 2-day lecture at the college level. And I know some people are gonna be like, yeah, this is fine at the college level, but it doesn't work for little kids. How do I teach my third graders these things? Well, yeah, you can adapt it down, but the process of how you plan your lesson, it's all the same. Okay. You've got to have like these, like I said in a previous episode of this, these little breadcrumbs where you lead the kids from one idea to the next. And yeah, when you're teaching third graders, you're going to have to do it a little more hands-on. You're going to have to be there and guide them more explicitly. But I'm doing the same thing. And as I mentioned before, I'm in front of a giant classroom of well over 100 students, almost 150 kids in a big auditorium. So I'm a little bit limited on what I can do. And so I have to be the one guiding it, from the front of the room. But yes, when you're doing this with small kids, obviously you can do things where you're moving around and you can go a bit slower and go piece by piece, but it's all the same. You have to have the steps that lead them from one idea to the next idea to the next idea, and try still to incorporate things beyond just the subject area you're teaching in this case, English. You can bring in other fields, and I'm going to show you how I do that. Before I get into the history part, like I said, I'm going to introduce something else really quickly. Since this is the first day of this lecture, it's not quite as complex as introducing the poetry that I did in a previous episode, because this novel is a bit more exciting than students would think of poetry. And so that introduction that day was quite long. It was well over 10 minutes of just getting students prepared to even read poetry. Plus we did we read some poetry out loud to get the kids talking a bit. This one I thought this will be a little easier to ease us into, because this novel is there's a lot of exciting stuff and it's very dramatic, and this won't be as hard, but still, we're talking about 19th century literature. We're reading A Tale of Two Cities. There's going to be language and style in Dickens' writing that is going to be unfamiliar to them. So I still have to introduce it. I can't just throw the book at them and go, let's start talking about this novel, which they're going to be completely, unprepared for. So I'm going to show you how I walked them into it. Again, it's shorter because I don't have to go quite as deep. I don't have to hold their hands quite as far, but it still is about 5 minutes worth of me easing them into this discussion we're about to have. And then what you'll see then is, before I ever get to the text, before I ever start referring to specific pages in the text, literary techniques, plot points, all of that stuff, I spent a good 15 to 20 minutes just building historical context. All right. So again, when people are out there saying, oh, we don't teach enough history, it's like, well, English teachers should be doing a better job of that, because if you're doing it right, you're teaching, if it's something historical, you're teaching the history alongside the literature part of it. So, it's easier when you're doing things from the past like I am here, but you should always build the context for your students so that they see how the book emerged and why it was relevant then, and better yet, why it's still relevant today, because we don't just leave the past in the past. The past is still important for us now, and that's what I'm going to do in this lecture for you. So just for the first couple of minutes here, I want you to see how I introduce the students to this topic. We're diving into the novel A Tale of Two Cities, and I want you to see if you can grasp the technique that I'm using here. What's my sales pitch for getting them hopefully a little bit excited about reading this new piece of text in our class? So here's how I started this lesson.
I'm going to share just a quick little anecdote that I shared with my section on the first day, but I'll share it with the other two groups as well.
just really quickly there, again, referring back to a previous class where I knew they talked about these things. So let me just remind them, this isn't brand new. I'm just reiterating some things they would have already heard at least a little bit of, and I'm going to add more information to that. So again, always referencing where we were, here's where we are now, and then giving hints as to where the rest of this class is going to go.
I was at home. It was earlier this summer because I was at home in the middle of the day. I was watching a sports talk show on television, sports radio talk show, and the host was interviewing an author who was releasing a brand new book, and so he was talking about the book and the people in it, and one of the words that he used really caught my ear. He described the person that the book is about as being a Shakespearean character, living a Shakespearean life, which I thought, wow, that's a pretty brave choice for a journalist to use on a sports talk show, because considering the host is a sports guy, the journalist himself is a sports guy, but also you'd have to assume that millions of people across America that are listening are tuned in to hear about sports, not hear a word like Shakespearean. What's so interesting about that is in popular culture or even in our everyday conversation, we might hear a word like that that's based on a person or an idea or some text from the past. And if you don't know what those important texts or people or ideas are, you are left out of the conversation. The journalist didn't take time to explain what he meant by Shakespearean. He just assumed that the listener knew, and I assume he did, I did. But I wondered about all those people across America tuning in that had no idea what the word Shakespearean might mean. The fact is that's why we have these classes. That's why we talk about these texts that we think, oh, they're old, who cares about them anymore? We talk about these authors or these influential figures from the past. Well, it's because they built the foundation of who we are today, and they still are relevant. Even 500 years later, someone's still using a word like Shakespearean. So if you're going to participate in the culture, you have to know what those foundational elements are, and that's what a class like this is. That's what texts like this do for us. They allow us to participate, actually have conversations with each other where we have common ground. We know what we're talking about. You don't have to sit and explain it. I can say Shakespearean and you know exactly what I might mean. So it's important that we grasp these cultural foundations because it's who we are. If you don't know where you came from, you're going to be lost. So the word Shakespearean is part of our dialect, or part of our vernacular, but so is the word Dickensian, actually. If you don't know what Dickensian means, then maybe that's something you might need to look into.
So what I'm doing here, just really quickly, is I'm always making a sales pitch, especially at the college level or at the upper levels. Sometimes you can get young kids to be excited about things just because everything's brand new to them, and so it's really not that hard to get them ready to absorb something, even if it's in a school environment. They can think a lot of things are fun. But when you're talking to older students, for me, I've always said, not to make it be too crass about it, but it's a sales pitch. Like, I have to convince you to like this. And so it's my job to make that case. And so what I'm doing here is I'm making an E.D. Hirsch case, a cultural literacy case, where there are things you really need to know. If you're going to be a citizen, if you're going to be somewhat intellectual, if you're going to participate in the culture, there are certain things you just need to know, because you're going to be in conversation someday, or you're going to be listening to something on television or on the radio, and someone's going to say something, and if you don't get it, that means you can't participate. And we should want our young people, and then everyone else in the culture, to be able to participate in as many cultural interactions as possible. And so that's the case I'm making here, to introduce the students to, here's why we need to read this book. I'm going to give you a million other reasons, but here's a big one. What I also did, as I mentioned in previous videos, I'm constantly reminding students, hey, remember this thing we already talked about once? If you've had me before, you've heard me talk about this. You remember that? And even if they haven't, even if they weren't in my previous class where I talked about this Shakespearean idea, well, now I'm teaching you something new, and you're going to see how it's related to this idea of being Dickensian. This is another word we kind of need to know. So again, I'm always relating this other thing we talked about in the past, that's still relevant now, and I'm going to show you how it's going to be more relevant through the rest of this class period. So where we were, where we are, where we're going, and incorporating cultural literacy as a kind of the sales pitch element of it is very important. And so I'm bringing in another context. Here's Shakespeare. Now Shakespeare I'm going to connect to Dickens. And now I'm going to connect Dickens to things they might have seen in the culture on their own, because here's some examples.
So the way that Dickens himself and this book pop up in popular culture or in our everyday life are actually kind of amazing. They pop up more than you might think. If you remember the film from a couple years ago, The Dark Knight Rises, you might not know that Christopher Nolan built that film around the premise of A Tale of Two Cities. If you pay attention to the ending, the final speech that Commissioner Gordon gives about Bruce Wayne and his death, that's taken right from the text of Tale of Two Cities. The final passage is right from the text. We also, the kangaroo courts that are in that film, the way that Bane acts is very much in line with someone like Madame Defarge. If you don't know that when you watch it, can you still get something out of that movie? Well, of course you can. It's still entertaining. But if you know where it comes from, if you know the foundations that made the themes of a film like that, it becomes that much more interesting. It provides many more layers for you to consider and to think that, oh, well, Christopher Nolan didn't just think of these things himself. He actually borrowed these ideas from something 170 years ago. So this book is part of our culture, whether you even recognize it or not. I know you can't see that, but when I post this for you, you can look at these things yourself. If you just type into Google, A Tale of Two, and click on the news feed, because if you type it in normal, it'll, of course, the book will pop up. But you type it into the news feed, the phrase A Tale of Two will produce endless amounts of hits. Because anyone writing an article where you want to compare two things, the easy shortcut way of doing it is just say, a tale of two, etc. So the one up here was, there's a tale of two like quarterbacks, a tale of two governors, a tale of two anything. But if you don't know where the phrase a tale of two comes from, you're missing out on a part of the foundation of who we are as a culture. It's important to know where these things came from. 2 weeks ago was the Ryder Cup, and I was watching, if you watched the first day, the Americans did very well in the morning, but then played terribly in the afternoon. So the next day when coverage started, the announcer, to kick off that day's coverage, actually said this quote, "It's fitting that we're here in Paris," that's where the tournament was held, "because yesterday for the Americans, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times." Again, I watched television thinking, wow, I can't believe it that the announcer would make that cultural connection, running the risk that maybe millions of people watching around the world or watching on television wouldn't know what the best of times and the worst of times means. But what it meant was, well, the Americans were really happy in the morning on that day, and then the second half of the day they played terribly and it went horribly wrong for them. So again, anytime where there's a change in things going from being very positive or going well to being very negative, the shortcut vernacular of best of times, worst of times is something that if you know what this book is about, you can instantly understand what that person might mean. So understanding the shortcuts of culture, that's why we have you read these texts. That's why we talk about these people. That's why we talk about these ideas, because this is where we came from, and they still exist today. And if you don't know what they mean, you get left out, and we don't want anybody to be left out of our cultural conversations. After all, how can you influence culture with truth if you don't know what our culture is made up of? So, a little something to think about from a cultural standpoint of why we do what we do in this class and where this book might take us.
So really quickly there, a couple points. One, again, as I started, I explained an experience that happened to me. I was at home and I heard this thing and I thought about it. Oh, Shakespearean. Wow, that's interesting. And then I took the thing that happened to me and I related it to something that might have happened to them if they'd been paying attention. That made it a little more personal to them in the movies they watch. It's about sports. I have a class, there's athletes all over this classroom. Like, let me make a sports connection. Let me make a reference to what you might find on a Google search. Like, I'm making it more relevant for them. So I went from something that only happened to me that one day to here's what could happen to you if you're paying attention all the time in all these different domains of life. It's not just literature. It's not just history. It's also sports. It's also movies. It's also news. It's all around us. So like I mentioned before, if you're going to participate in the culture, you got to know these references, and that's why we study some of these things. At our school, our kind of mission statement was transforming culture with truth. And so I brought it even more focused into them and saying, here's why this applies to you specifically. If you're going to be at this school where this is our ethos, you can't just skate by and go, I don't need to read that book. I don't need to hear that history lesson. I don't need to know that philosophy, yada, yada. I need to know all of this because it's all part of the culture. And if I'm going to influence it positively, I need to be able to have these conversations with people. So again, I took something that was from another lecture, from another class, and also was something that happened to me, and I related it gradually, step by step, to this book, this author we're going to talk about right now, and how it relates to you, how you might have seen it in the culture. And now we're going to start, getting more into the specifics of, okay, well, what's really going on with this book? And so I'm still not ready to get into the text yet because I need to present to them, again, some of the historical background of what literature was like and how this book came about and what it meant and what it's trying to accomplish as a novel. And so even before we get into the book, I'm laying some historical groundwork here. So let's see what we talk about here.
We need a really, really brief historical context here. And luckily for you, if you remember from Hume 201 and 202, You might be able to see this already.
Just really quickly there, again, referring back to a previous class where I knew they talked about these things. So let me just remind them, this isn't brand new. I'm just reiterating some things they would have already heard at least a little bit of, and I'm going to add more information to that. So again, always referencing where we were, here's where we are now, and then giving hints as to where the rest of this class is going to go.
For lack of a better phrase, I'm just going to really generalize so that we all understand what we're talking about. Up through the Renaissance, let's say, which is where you ended up in Hume 202. The idea of classical literature, all right, that's what tended to prevail from the ancient Greek times all the way up through the Renaissance. Again, I'm generalizing big time, but that'll give us a starting point. So the themes of those pieces of literature or those pieces of art tended to be aiming at whatever the highest good was, the highest beauty, the highest form of justice, the highest form of goodness, all those things, right? And the artistic productions that came out of those time periods not only aimed at those ideas in their content, but even how they're constructed. So if you remember when I came and talked about John Donne, just really quickly about the way that poems were constructed, we see the attention to detail in those pieces of poems, so those couplets that have to have the perfect rhyme and rhythm, the sonnets that have the precise syllabic constructions, they have the precise rhyme schemes, because the construction of the piece of art itself was intended to be a model or the pursuit of perfection, okay? So classical literature tended to have that as their main goal. But once we start reaching the Enlightenment era, once we start picking up what's happening in the midst of and then after these two revolutions we've been talking about, art and especially literature start to change a bit. And instead of being the pursuit of whatever this abstract highest ideal is and creating art and literature that is perfectly constructed, right, that very few people can do, only the best people can actually construct poems that way, let's say, it becomes a little more free-flowing. And in this era, what we call the Romantic era, this typifies generally what good literature is. So what exactly is it? Well, in this turn in the 19th century, we have the noticeable reflection of these social movements that we've been talking about in this class, and that people are being influenced emotionally to respond to them. So, in our Sister Revolutions book, we get an interesting quote from Robespierre that we talked about the other day.
History reference to the previous class, but also the book, so I pull out the text and read directly from it.
We get the sense of what emotion we're talking about. Revolutionaries impatiently dismissed reserve, understatement, and subtlety as signs of indifference to the revolution. Their world historical enterprise called for hyperbole and passion. If emotions were not histrionic, inflamed, excessive, volcanic, they were deemed insufficiently revolutionary. People were not permitted to have calm emotions about anything, observed Tocqueville. Words had to surpass the feelings one wanted to express. So the connection between the feelings I have and the words that I produce directly correlates with the literature of the time period. And so what we see from the other famous writers of the time period, like William Wordsworth, who said, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. That's like the defining line of Romantic era literature. Spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, where I'm observing the world and I've been so taken by it, I'm so moved by it that I have to write it down immediately and express myself to my full humanness. That's what poetry of the time and eventually other forms of literature of the time tried to do. Percy Shelley, another famous poet of the time, said that literature of this age that we're talking about now has arisen as if it were from a new birth, that for the best writers, electric life burns, less from their own spirit than the spirit of the age. So again, the movement of the Enlightenment and beyond is actually pushing these authors forward, and their emotions are coming out into the text. William Hazlitt echoes that. He's a critic of the time, wrote on a variety of literary and social topics. Said, new literature had its origin in the French Revolution. It was a time of promise, a renewal of the world, and of letters and literature. So there's a distinct separation that starts, evolution, let's say, that starts to occur right around this time period. We're moving away from these carefully constructed, perfect representations of art and literature into, no, what the author feels, what the society around him is causing him to react to, that's what becomes good literature. And it shapes all of the 19th century.
What students don't know, because I haven't given the lecture yet in this semester, is this is what I talk about in the Romantic poetry lesson, which I posted an excerpt from a couple weeks ago. So the idea is I already know where I'm going with this. So when I then get to that day, I can then refer back to some of the discussion we already had here so that they know, oh, okay, these things all tie together. So I introduce Wordsworth, Shelley, these authors that are going to make an appearance in a future lecture of mine. But, again, the kids don't quite know that yet, but I'm tying all of these threads together with with this lecture so that, again, students aren't going to see by the time they get done with me for these days that I'm with them, that, oh, I wasn't just saying random things that were just isolated pieces of knowledge, isolated facts of history, isolated pieces of literature. It's all connected. And so even though we're not at the poetry unit yet, I make reference to the poets because that's who was influencing even the novels of the time. So the entire philosophical movement of what art was doing in the 19th century is reflected in poetry, in novels, in art, in history, in philosophy. They're all connected. And so I'm just, again, laying that groundwork, the background historical information, so students understand why this novel is going to sound like this and why it doesn't sound like pieces of literature from the past.
Now, Dickens comes around slightly later. He's classified as a Victorian author, not necessarily a Romantic author, but we have to know that as a child and as a young person, he grew up in the Romantic period. And so you can see it definitely affects how he writes and how he views the world. I also personally sort of extend the Romantic era beyond what it is because I can see its influence all the way past the 1860s, let's say, even further than that. So I think the Romantic era actually goes further. And Dickens combines elements of the Romantic era with what we call the Victorian era, which is not only the emotionality of these authors, but also of observing the world and all of its true complicated facets. So social issues, political problems, man interaction with man. These are things that now the Victorian era picks up. So there goes from the heavy emotionality to a hint of, not a hint, but a fair amount of realism. We still don't call it realist literature, but it's now that emotion is infused with a realistic depiction of societies. So that's where we pick up with a guy like Charles Dickens and how we get a book like Tale of Two Cities.
So what I'm doing here just really quickly is in my classes that are actual literature courses, we go into much more detail about, these artistic evolutions over time, the differences between, of what realism was and, where romanticism kind of starts and stops and all that stuff. But for these kids, this is just a general survey course that's mostly a history and philosophy class. I don't need them to know all of those details. I just need them to know, the basics of some romanticism, which again, I'll get to in another class, and how that literature has a unique look to it compared to what came before it. So it depends on the course you're teaching. I don't need to give kids every single thing. I just need to give them the skeleton that I can then hang all the meat on here as I go into the detail of the book. So that's why I talked about that.
Joseph Conrad, who's an author in the 20th century, when you look back on the novel, because we might think, well, we have this book and we wonder what exactly it is. And Conrad, looking back, says this is what a novel should do. What is a novel if not a conviction of our fellow men's existence strong enough to take upon itself a form of imagined life clearer than reality, and whose accumulated verisimilitude, means truthfulness, of selected episodes puts to shame the pride of documentary history? Meaning, maybe we can learn more about the world we live in than just the facts we read from a history book or from a science text. That there's actually truths out there that can be depicted in a fictional form that actually are clearer and easier to understand and maybe even more truthful than just telling the facts of history. So when we look at Dickens in this historical novel, we wonder if he's successful or not.
So I knew that I had that line in this lecture. And so when I saw the publications going around this past week about, well, maybe history is more important. Maybe kids need to know more facts about history, which I'm all for kids learning facts about history. That's great. But there might be things that we can teach in literature that might be just as valuable or even more valuable, perhaps, than just some reading more facts in history books. Aristotle said that poetry, or art and literature, was truer and more philosophical than studying history. So even he said it, a historical figure, said it all those years ago, where he knew that the difference between history and the arts was that history isolated things in moments in time, which is great. Again, we need to know those facts. But what poetry and the arts do is they don't describe the particulars, they describe the universals. And so that's where I'm going to go with this lecture eventually, is we read this novel because it has universal truths. And I'm going to come back to like, well, is this historically accurate or not? And I make the argument like, well, does it matter? I mean, it's historical for sure, but we can't always get bogged down in the tiny little factual details when there's a universal truth that's way more important to learn about. And again, I'm not saying that should come at the expense of history. We should be teaching both history and literature equally. But we can't say, well, since literature doesn't always deal in fact, it's not as valuable as history. So like that's just not a good argument. And so that's why I'm showing this bit of a historical dive into a literary piece.
I'm not usually huge on author biographies because we as critics don't put a lot of stock in connecting people's real lives to their fictional lives, fictional creations. So I don't usually go into this too heavily, but I'm just going to give you a couple things to think about because in Dickens' case, you can totally see what comes out in his fictional works.
Just really quickly, I clip out this little biographical section. Again, I'm talking about history. I'm talking about his personal life. But it's actually pretty simple. It's just a quick overview. And so I thought, you can go look into Dickens if you want yourself. But as far as it relates to the complexity of the novel, it's important, but it's not as important as some of the other historical ideas I'm about to get to. So this little section is clipped. I just wanted to include that tiny intro to it because I do talk about Dickens as an historical figure and how his life reflected some of the themes that he brings up in the novel. But I'm going to get to some bigger historical ideas here as we go that I just thought are a little more important for this breakdown. So that's all.
He's already quite successful. The Tale of Two Cities is written in 31 weekly installments. So a boom in literacy started, it had been ongoing, but it really picked up right before, let's say, the American Revolution. So, in the 1700s, people start becoming much more literate. It's not just for the clergy, not just for rich people. Many regular folks, common citizens, start having a little bit more access to education, which means there's more literacy in those nations. And so with an increase in literacy, there becomes an increase for people to produce more, right? Now people can actually read my stuff. I can get published. So we have these magazines and newspapers that publish entire books week by week. It becomes a serialization. What this serializing does is it actually, it allows people to have something to read every single week, which is nice. But it also created a way for the audience to interact with the author, which doesn't usually happen when an author secludes himself and writes a whole book and publishes it and you don't hear anything from him for 3 years. The author can hear on the streets what people think of how his book is going. And that influences what the author might write, because then the next week the author might hear, the public seems to really like this character. Let's expand that person's role a little bit more in this story. This person really hates this character. Let's get rid of him, or let's take his plot and have it disappear, which actually happens in several of his books. It's kind of frustrating that you'll be reading about a certain character and halfway through the book he'll disappear. Well, chances are he got feedback that no one liked that character, get rid of him. And so the author actually adjusts to the audience. So when we have weekly installments, it's much like television shows that we have today or that we've had in the past. You're only getting a piece every week. The public can react to it. The creators adjust to what the public likes. And it's it's just an interesting way of publishing work that's very different from publishing an entire work one at a time. So what also happens with these serialized novels is because you're paid, you're contracted based on how many installments you're gonna do. So as we said, Tale of Two Cities is done over 31 weeks. Some were longer. And so what we end up getting from Dickens and these other successful writers of the time period is, in some cases, these massive books. Tale of Two Cities is actually, I think, his second shortest book. You might think it's long. It's super tiny compared to his other books. He has a couple that are 800-900 pages. Well, why? Because he's got to fill up like 50 weeks of newspapers, right? So he has these massive stories with tons and tons of characters. One of his novels has 45 named important characters. 45. And that doesn't even include the people who don't even have names. So Dickens is just one of the authors who takes advantage of this serialization process to create these gigantic works of literature, these novels. What we also see is, as these books have the size to sustain it, we see the deeper connections into the social issues. So the author can draw out these social problems, such as poverty or injustice or whatever the author's talking about, in many installments over a very long period of time and affecting many different characters all at the same time. So the way in which these books are published dramatically influences what actually shows up in the books.
So I think just from a historical standpoint, that's really important to know that kids need to know, hey, the way books were published haven't always been the way they're published now. I mean, they've changed dramatically just in the last 10 years. Now that there's online publishing, you can publish things yourself. So we've gone through these stages of how things got published. And since this is a class or a unit on Charles Dickens in this novel, we need to know from a historical standpoint, well, why does the book look this way? Why does it sound this way? What influenced Dickens to write in this style? Not only the kind of undergirding of the romantic philosophy that guided his style, but also the logistics of how do things actually get published? How are people actually going to read my stuff? Well, that's going to affect the way it gets produced. And I go into that next. So again, when we're talking about history, well, there's a variety of things we could talk about history, and it could be just facts and events, but here is an industry that influenced how books got produced. And so it's really useful from a historical standpoint to know the evolution of publishing, especially regarding someone like Dickens, because the publishing process was so vital to how his work became famous.
What we also see when things are serialized is the author has to create cliffhangers. There has to be a stopping point because well, I can't just keep writing. I got to figure out a way to stop so that the audience picks it back up next week and wants to keep reading. And so if you notice through many of the chapters, a lot of them end on an interesting piece of information, and then that's the end of the chapter. Or something just happens and you get a break. So a couple examples of that. The first installment ends right after chapter 3, after Manette is released from prison. So we have this beginning where he's in prison, they break him out, and that's the break. All right? And then we're left to wonder, well, why was he in there in the first place? What's going to happen next? Well, that'll happen next week. Tale of Two Cities also has a pretty amazing structure because it fits perfectly for what a story should do, actually. At the end of Act 2, the book The Second, right, we have the character with the biggest secret going into the most dangerous place, which is exactly what should happen at the end of paragraph 2 of Act 2 of any book or of any movie. It's that mark in the film or in the book where, okay, you're in it now. You can't get out of it. You're going to have to face the worst, and that's usually what pushes you to the end. So the structure of Tale of Two Cities is if you understand the structure, it's very helpful for understanding how it was put together and why it is such an effective book.
So I've been talking about the Romantic era, I've been talking about Dickens, I've been talking about publishing and history. I need to bring them towards the text because I don't want them forgetting we're actually studying a specific text here. So that's why I connect those ideas to the publishing stuff, to how the book is structured. What's also happening here is students may have started reading the book. They were supposed to, but of course we know students don't always do that. So if they have started, I was highlighting something that maybe you've already noticed this. Maybe you've started to notice these cliffhangers in the short chapters. And you've wondered, oh, why is he doing that? How did he come up with that idea? Well, I just explained the background of that. Or if you haven't read it yet, you can be on the lookout for this. So the thing I'm explaining here is, one, I'm tying all that background information to the actual text we're about to dive into. But also, no matter if you've already started reading or if you haven't started reading yet, you need to be on the lookout for this because this is actually pretty interesting and this is what makes the book so good. So I'm trying to cover as many different types of students as I possibly can here in this section.
I've also included, if you want to click this link when I post this PowerPoint, you can actually see through this link the weekly installment. So you can actually check for yourself where the breaks are in your own text and see how they had so many cliffhangers that kept people reading.
So just really quickly, there's a link to history, to the actual primary source documents, so that students, if they want, they can go look at these things themselves and know that I wasn't just making all this up. You can read the original newspaper installments and line them up to how they show up in our book, and that's how you see the structure, and especially those cliffhangers throughout the book. So, I don't dwell on it because, this is a literature class, not a history class, but I'm providing primary source documents for students that they can go explore if they would like.
So Dickens becomes super successful. He satisfies his readers for many, many years. He becomes quite wealthy from it. And when you participate in a market like serialization of books or newspaper or magazine publication, you have to embrace the capitalistic process, which is what Dickens ends up doing. Sort of interesting, though, because many people think, oh, Dickens is the voice for being hostile to capitalism, that he's the key literary figure for criticizing these class hierarchies, for social injustice, commenting on poverty and things that are unfair, that he's the most important writer. And in a way, that is true, which led Karl Marx, who had read a lot of Charles Dickens by this time. He said that Dickens issued to the world more political and social truths than have ever been uttered by all the professional politicians, publicists, and moralists put together. So a guy like Karl Marx ends up liking your work, you must think, well, he's really anti-capitalism. But he's actually not. Dickens, throughout his books, though he does obviously address those things we've been talking about, he does discuss store owners who are doing the right thing. That owning something, that being an entrepreneur, that having ownership of property is very important and valuable for maintaining our social structures. He, in many of his books, has descriptions of products being available in London or elsewhere that wouldn't normally be available except for the capitalistic process, such as walking through a market and having fruits and vegetables available in England in wintertime. Yeah, that doesn't occur without capitalism. He also discusses how some characters really make bad economic decisions, and they're punished for it, which they should be in capitalism. So it's a little bit unfair to say Dickens is the leading figure for kind of the proletariat voice or for social injustice, or that he's the biggest defender of poverty and he hates capitalism. That's not exactly completely accurate. Dickens was probably like a lot of people during this time period. He saw the benefits of capitalism, the emergence of industrialism, that there's more products, there's more things, we get wealthier. Those are good things. He embraced that, while also recognizing that, yeah, there are some problematic components to it as well, and that's what he writes about. So he's sort of stuck in the middle like most people are.
So again, raising a historical figure, bringing him into the conversation. I reference Karl Marx, and I'm about to get even further into this idea of economics. So again, connecting to other ideas, other fields of study, but all of this is history, because these are the debates that were going on in the 19th century. And also, something I do a lot in classes is to get ahead of students' assumptions. Maybe they haven't read this book yet. Maybe they don't know anything about the time period. And so they're doing some Google searches. They're doing, ChatGPT wasn't out at this point. This is 2018. But they're kind of like just doing basic searches like, well, what do I need to know about this? And they might hear something like, oh, Dickens was loved by Karl Marx because he's such a defender of the common working man and facing the injustices of society and all this stuff. It's like, well, no, that's not actually fully true. And so I want to kind of debunk some of those myths that get perpetuated in other classrooms. And so fortunately, I was at a school where I could talk about capitalism and free market and things like that. But, there's a lot of bad information out there. And so I'm spending this little chunk giving some historical and economic background, but also debunking some of the myths they might find if they were searching elsewhere.
Here's what Paul Cantor, who's another English scholar, in his books, Literature and the Economics of Liberty, which was a very, very important book for me in my own research.
Just really quick plug there. Dr. Cantor, I've mentioned I talk about him in my Hamlet lesson. I talk about him in my Why Read series. Really great scholar, Shakespearean scholar, but knowledgeable about a million different areas. One of those was economics, and his book on literature and economics is what influenced me in my dissertation research, which led me to write my first book, which he actually blurbed right on the back. So very generous man, and I use his research a lot. And as you can see, I'm flipping to the actual pages in his book because I want students to know this information you need for life, it's in books. Let me share them with you.
This is what he says about Charles Dickens and his success in the marketplace as an author. Dickens once gave a speech where he was really thankful for the emerging middle class, that people had saved enough money, that they were working hard enough to have extra money, that they could buy his literature and buy other people's art. He viewed that as being very valuable. But Cantor writes, some might cynically observe that Dickens had every reason to speak well of a middle-class public that made him rich and famous. But that's just the point. The Victorian audience he's writing for had the good taste to single out Dickens as the greatest literary genius in its midst, thus effectively refuting the myth that a true artist is always misunderstood by his contemporaries and rejected by the marketplace. Under Dickens' leadership, a journal he edited called Household Words was a staunch advocate of free trade, defending capitalism in mid-Victorian England. Dickens himself was an accomplished entrepreneur. When he grew dissatisfied with the conditions under which he was being forced to publish, nothing stopped him from setting up as a publisher himself. And he became very wealthy in the process. He understood that the rapid development of commercial publishing had a liberating effect on its authors, freeing them from their centuries-old dependence on patrons and giving them more direct access to a newly created mass audience. This is only due to capitalism. All Dickens wanted was a chance to prove himself as an author in the marketplace. And when he had the opportunity, he clearly made the most of it. Along with Shakespeare, Dickens stands as the most convincing proof that commercial and artistic success in literature are not incompatible. So the old line that, oh, well, no one understands me, I'm the tortured artist, I'm going to be poor and struggling my whole life. No, if you do it right, you actually can be successful. So those of you who are artists and writers and musicians and whatever else you want to be, creators of any kind, participating in the marketplace, it can work. You have to be good, but it works. So based on the fact that Dickens ends up becoming pretty much the wealthiest author in all of England, maybe the joke was on Marx. He's not the person Marx thought he was.
All right, so that's I know that's a longer piece than I did last time, but I just want to demonstrate this is how much history and background information I present before we ever even get into the text of the novel, which is what we start doing here. So, I talk for 25 minutes or so, laying all this groundwork, leading students from, here's why we generally need to read these things from the past, so that you can participate in the cultural conversations that have those as their foundation. And then we lead them to, well, what was going on in the time period? What was that era like, from the social stuff to, especially in this case, the publishing and the artistic stuff. I lay a little bit of groundwork on the philosophical ideas underpinning these artistic creations. And I give a little bit of background on Charles Dickens himself. I give a background on how he published, how his work became so popular. I gave background historically on other people who were interpreting his work at the time and how they may have been not always quite right. And now that we look back on it, we have a better understanding of it. All of this is before I ever even get to the book itself. All right, I've been hinting at what you're going to see in the book along the way, especially the structure and kind of cliffhanger stuff. But we haven't even gotten to the book yet, because this is just the introduction. And I incorporate more history throughout the lesson, but I wanted to just demonstrate that those of us who teach English, especially who've been doing this a long time and are scholars in these things, we do this. And there should be more people who do it. And you can do this at the lower levels too. I know you might be thinking, oh, well, the kids are just sitting there listening to you talk for 25 minutes. Yeah, that's true. And I said, you have to kind of address this differently with younger kids. You can't have them sitting this long, just hearing one voice. You need to break this up a little bit. But the breadcrumbs I'm laying for students and providing that historical background, this should be done in any kind of literature lesson you're teaching. And so if you're not doing that, you're going to start, getting people upset that, well, we don't teach enough history. We need to stop so much reading and start teaching history instead. It's like, no, we need to be teaching both. We need literature teachers who incorporate history into their lessons, like I do, and all my other coursework that I offer for parents and teachers, at all levels. And we need history teachers to be making references to literary ideas, whether in speeches or in books that historical figures have written. They need to be bringing in English as well. We need to be teaching both of them equally. I'm not saying one is more important than the other. They both need to be doing both at the same time. And that's how we get smarter kids. As I mentioned in the previous lesson, the goal is to get these kids to have this web, because that's what their brain actually is. It's all these connections. And if we can do that explicitly with our instruction, then they have this big, broad framework that whenever something new comes along, they have a place to put it. And it resonates with them. It relates to something they already know about, and it connects, and they can put it in their longer term memory. But if we don't have this broad frame of reference, these connections, these interdisciplinary instructional techniques, well, students, they aren't going to see how their lives are influenced by these things, and they aren't going to see how all of this is related to each other. They're just going to go through life going, well, I go to history class on Monday, and then I go to English class on Wednesday, and then I go to philosophy class on Thursday. It's all just separated. Our job as teachers should be to connect them as much as possible. And I was in a class here, my guest lectures here, we're in a course that was doing this on purpose. We had a history professor, and then, someone who talked about art, and now I was bringing in English. And so we brought that all together on purpose. But even if you're not in a school like that, you're just a normal classroom teacher teaching 5th grade, this is what you should also be doing. You should be incorporating all of these subject areas together. So when you're doing your history lesson, you should talk about English. When you're doing your English lesson, you should talk about history. And whatever other things you're able to talk about, you should talk about them in an intertwined method, because that's the framework, that's the web that gets built in your students' brains, and that's what makes you smarter. And that's, back to Hirsch, that's what makes you culturally literate. When you can understand all the different references, and then better yet, understand how they're all connected to each other, well, then that's what makes you a smart citizen. And then what makes you super smart is if you can see all the connections, and you see how they're related and how they can be synthesized, and how those synthesized new creations can become something new, and now we can go towards creativity. Well, that's what geniuses do. So like, if we want to get our kids to be as smart as possible, we shouldn't be siloing all this information. We should be creating as many opportunities for kids to become culturally literate, having the facts of the world around them, but also not just facts, but references even to things from the fictional world, from the literary and artistic world, because it all matters, because that's what our culture is based on. This is where we came from. We have to know these things. If we're going to participate with each other, if we're going to get along and not fight so much with each other, we have to have a common language, common cultural references. And so this is what I do in my classes. This is what I do in almost all of my courses I've built online. This is what I used to do for 25 years as a classroom teacher. So this can be done. Good teachers do this. And if you're running a school, or if you're in a school where this isn't happening, well, you need to raise your voice and say, we could be doing this better. We need to be more interdisciplinary. We need to be bringing in these other subject areas and not just talking about one thing at one time. So I hope if you're a teacher out there who's stuck in a situation where you're only allowed to talk about your topic, I hope you rebel against that, because good teachers, as I've said, I kind of do this naturally, but you can force yourself to just do it. And the kids will like it way more. They'll learn way faster. It'll stick in their long-term memory better for testing purposes, or just for life purposes, even better. But that's what we need to be doing. So, as I said, this all started because I saw a piece this week that was about, well, maybe history is more important than English. It's like, well, not if you're teaching English properly. If you're teaching English properly, you can incorporate the history with it. And that's what I do here. So I hope this is helpful. I know that was longer than my previous episode, but I talked a lot about history here. And again, I actually do more of this throughout the rest of the lecture, but this was just a kind of a consistent chunk that I thought I'd show you. So I hope that was helpful. If you're an English teacher, talk more about history. It's really helpful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.